In 1887, in the remote Ozarks of Arkansas, 23 miles from any settlements, twin sisters were constantly pregnant by their brother, Thaddeus Cormier. He made Letitia and Cordelia pregnant 23 times over 9 years because he thought God wanted bloodlines to be pure. It was found out by a doctor's records. Investigators found 11 graves of boys killed for their covenant. How did this terrible thing stay hidden? What kind of religious belief allowed him to enslave his sisters? Why did the witnesses not say anything? The White River Valley in Arkansas's Ozark Mountains wasn't just far away, it was also out of time. In 1887, families lived in hollows so deep that the snow buried them for 4 months in a row. The nearest neighbor might have been 6 miles away, over ridges that could kill someone who wasn't ready. This was a place where the Civil War had only ended in theory, where federal power was more of an idea than a real thing, and where families made their own rules. The isolation was not only physical, but also philosophical. Mountain families chose to stay away from a world they didn't trust and were afraid of. In these secret valleys, patriarchs had power that no government far away could question, and secrets could be buried as deep as the roots of 100-year-old oaks. Josiah Cormier had chosen to be alone on purpose. He was a Confederate deserter who had left his unit in 1863. He and his young wife, Prudence, ran away to the deepest hollow he could find, which was 16 miles from the rough wagon trace. That was the only road. He built a double-cabin structure out of hand-hewn logs here, cleared 6 acres for corn and squash, and raised 3 children in complete privacy. He had a family Bible, a farmer's almanac, and a medical book that he had stolen from an army surgeon that had been damaged by water. Books that would change his son's mind in ways he never thought possible. Josiah had a simple and absolute view of the world. The outside world was beyond saving. Strangers had spiritual diseases, and his family's survival depended on staying completely away from the contamination of civilization. Josiah went into a religious frenzy when Prudence died, giving birth to their youngest child in 1870. He thought God was punishing him for leaving, and that his family would be cursed if he didn't stay completely pure. He told his kids Thaddeus, who was 5, and twin baby girls, Letitia and Cordelia, that being around other people would poison their souls, that their bloodline had to stay pure, and that they had to be careful not to let the modern world corrupt them. The twins grew up in a world where they only talked to their father and brother. 6 cleared acres, and the forest that surrounded them, on all sides, like a living wall, made up their whole world. In the winter of 1883, Josiah died. It wasn't until the spring thaw that the snow melted enough to show him lying near the woodpile. Thaddeus, who was 18 at the time, took charge of his 1-year-old sisters with the same authority their father had shown him. But Josiah's isolation was defensive. He was a scared man hiding from the consequences. Thaddeus's would become predatory. He spent his early years learning from his father, writing his own religious ideas in the margins of the family Bible, and building a worldview in which he was not only the head of the family, but also the divinely appointed protector of a sacred bloodline. From 1883 to 1887, even the few trappers and circuit riders who passed through the area couldn't see the Cormier home. Twice a year, Thaddeus would go to the far-off settlement of Parthenon to trade furs for salt, bullets, and cloth. People remembered him as thin, bearded, quiet, and always on the lookout. He never talked about his sisters. No one thought to ask. In a place where families kept to themselves and privacy was a basic right, no one thought anything of Thaddeus's silence. He was just another hermit living in the mountains, one of many who lived outside of the law and the community and were only accountable to God and their own conscience. The abuse started in the spring of 1887, when the twins were 15 years old. Thaddeus had spent years building his religious framework, writing equations of bloodline and divine selection in the margins of the family Bible. He thought of himself as a patriarch like Abraham, and thought that God had given him his sisters to help him start a pure family line. He said that their father had set this up before he died. He told them that the Bible said to do it. He told them they had no choice, that there was no world outside the hollow, and that there was no way to say what was going on was wrong. In Cormier Hollow, Thaddeus's word was law, his interpretation of Scripture was truth, and his sisters had no way of knowing that what he wanted was a crime and not a duty. Opal Gantry, a midwife from Hasty Bottom who worked with families in 40 miles of mountain country, confirmed Letitia's first pregnancy. Thaddeus called Opal in October 1887 and paid him in advance, which was unusual enough to be remembered. She found Letitia, who was 15 years old, already in labor in a cabin that smelled like mold and old smoke. Thaddeus stayed there the whole time, quoting Bible verses and calling the child a covenant made flesh. The girl baby lived. Opal wrote in her private journal that Letitia seemed to be far away, as if she were watching from a great distance. She also noticed that Cordelia, who was watching from a corner, looked like she was pregnant. In the next 5 years, Opal Gantry would be called to Cormier Hollow 14 times. She saw a pattern that shouldn't have been possible. Both sisters were almost always pregnant, giving birth to babies just months after having them, and their bodies showed the damage that happens when reproductive systems don't have time to heal. She saw male babies who didn't do well, which Thaddeus used as a euphemism for babies who went missing within days. She saw baby girls who lived but were malnourished, even when they were weeks old. Opal didn't say anything. She told herself that she didn't have any proof of a crime, that families who lived alone had different ways of doing things, and that getting involved might mean that the sisters wouldn't get any medical care at all. She took Thaddeus's money and left each time feeling ashamed of those who see evil and choose not to speak out. By 1892, families in the larger valley area had started to notice something was wrong in their own quiet way. Trappers had heard bad things about the Cormier place. Dogs wouldn't go near it. There were a lot of crows in one place. People who lived 6 miles away said they heard women's screams carried on certain winds. They thought they were panthers or spirits, anything but people in pain. The hollow beyond the world had become a place where the laws of nature seemed to be put on hold. There was a family living in a pocket of moral darkness that had been made possible by being alone and had been allowed to continue by being quiet. Dr. Wendell Beaumont didn't want to be a tool of justice. He had come to Arkansas to get lost in work and forget about his wife's death by doing endless mountain circuits where there was always a medical need and not many questions about his past. He was a doctor who had trained in Massachusetts and had done surgery with the Union Army. He was overqualified for frontier medicine, which made him the kind of observer who might see things that others would miss. His quarterly circuit covered 200 miles of Ozark land and 17 settlements and isolated homesteads. He kept very detailed records of not only treatments, but also family structures, the time between pregnancies, the death rates of infants, and environmental factors. This was both a professional habit and a way to deal with personal problems. The accuracy of numbers provided solace from sorrow. Beaumont met Thaddeus Cormier for the first time in October 1893. Thaddeus had gone to a Methodist meeting in Parthenon to get help for a sister who had milk fever. Beaumont rode with him for 3 hours into the mountains and noticed that Thaddeus only talked about the Bible and avoided any questions about himself. The cabin he found was worse than bad. It was purposefully bare, as if comfort itself were a sin. 2 young women who looked the same and were almost skeletal moved like shadows. One of them, Cordelia, was lying on a cornhusk mattress and was burning with a puerperal infection. A baby girl, maybe 2 weeks old, cried softly in a wooden box. A child who was probably 2 years old watched from a corner with big eyes. Beaumont used carbolic acid solution and quinine to treat the infection. Thaddeus read from Leviticus while Beaumont worked by lamplight. He saw Letitia moving in a strange way that made him think she was pregnant. He saw that both sisters had scars on their arms that looked like burns. He said that neither woman spoke unless Thaddeus told them to. He said that the kids were showing signs of developmental delay and malnutrition, even though there was enough corn in the stores. He asked Thaddeus about the father of the kids. Thaddeus smiled and said, "The Lord gives more to those who are faithful." Beaumont left, promising to come back for more. That night, he carefully wrote down everything in his ledger, even things he didn't fully understand yet. For example, he wrote that there were twin sisters, about 21 years old. One had just given birth, and the other was pregnant. There are a lot of young girls here. The household shows signs of strict patriarchal control. No mention of a husband or husbands. There are physical signs that suggest trauma may have happened more than once. The situation calls for close watching. In December 1893, he came back. Cordelia was better. Letitia looked like she was getting bigger. Since his last visit, a baby, maybe 3 weeks old, had been born. He didn't like the math. 2 months ago, when he last saw Letitia, she had just given birth and was still recovering from mastitis. Now she was pregnant again. The female body could quickly start ovulating again after giving birth, but this pattern suggested that she had become pregnant within weeks of giving birth. This is a dangerous and rare event that could mean either very high fertility or no time to recover between pregnancies. Beaumont started keeping an eye on the Cormier family in particular. Over the next year, his ledger entries showed a pattern that became harder and harder to explain by natural means. Cordelia gave birth to a girl in March 1894. Letitia is about 6 months pregnant. Letitia gave birth to a boy in June 1894, but he died soon after. Cordelia is showing signs that she is pregnant. In September 1894, Cordelia had a baby girl. Letitia is pregnant again. Letitia gave birth to a boy in January 1895, but he didn't do well. Cordelia is having a baby. The pattern was very unusual and very worrying from a medical point of view. Both sisters were pregnant almost all the time for 3 years. Baby boys are always dying. There is no mention of a father. Thaddeus was always there and in charge. The sisters' silence was full of trauma. Every time I went, I learned something new that added to the picture of systematic horror. The sisters flinched at sudden movements, never made eye contact, and their bodies showed signs of damage that went beyond what would be expected from normal childbirth on the frontier. Beaumont started to ask careful questions in nearby towns. At first, Opal Gantry, the midwife, was evasive. Then she got defensive. She told him, "I don't have the right to question how families run their lives." But in the end, she gave in over whiskey in her cabin. "Doctor, I've seen 23 pregnancies between those girls in 9 years. 23. I've seen babies born that don't see morning. I've seen those women treated like livestock. And I've kept my mouth shut because I'm a coward who needs the money, and because testifying against a white man in Newton County means I'd never work again." She let Beaumont read her personal journals, which were full of detailed records of dates, observations, payments from Thaddeus, and more. The paperwork was very damaging. Natural family planning was impossible because of the long gaps between pregnancies. The deaths of infants seemed to happen around the time of male births. In her notes, the sisters' health got worse, showing that they had been through a lot of trauma that no amount of poverty or hard living could explain. Beaumont gave his proof to Sheriff Harlan Wade in Jasper. Wade, a former Confederate officer who ran the county with little care, was not impressed. "You're saying a man is having sex with his sisters? That's a sin, not a crime. And killing his own kids? You have bodies? You have witnesses who will testify? You have any proof other than a Massachusetts Yankee's suspicions and a midwife's gossip?" The sheriff made it clear that Newton County took care of its own business. People from outside who caused trouble were not welcome. If Beaumont wanted to go through with this, he would need irrefutable proof and would be making enemies who would remember him for a long time. Beaumont came back to Cormier Hollow in April 1895, but this time he didn't tell anyone he was coming. He found Letitia in the middle of giving birth. Thaddeus wouldn't let him help. Thaddeus said, "Blood seals the covenant. Your interference pollutes sacred work." The standoff ended when Letitia started to bleed. Beaumont pushed his way in and brought a boy who lived for about an hour before Thaddeus said he had respiratory failure. Though Beaumont suspected smothering, he treated Letitia's tearing, documenting injuries consistent with repeated traumatic birth without adequate healing time. He saw something that no one else did while he worked: a leather-bound journal on a shelf full of Thaddeus's writing. While Thaddeus was busy burying the baby, Beaumont copied several pages. His hands shook as he read entries that mixed scripture with breeding records and theology with detailed accounts of sexual assault that were called conjugal covenant. Thaddeus had written down everything. The dates, the times of conception, the outcomes of the births, and the reasons he chose which babies to give back to God. Beaumont took his copies with him, hiding them in his medical bag. He now had proof in the form of documents that showed systematic incest, reproductive slavery, and probably infanticide. But he still needed physical proof that would convince a jury. And he needed it before Thaddeus destroyed the proof or took the family deeper into the woods where no law would ever reach them. The math of horror was clear. Now it was time to do the risky work of proof. In 1895, winter came early to the White River Valley. By late October, the snow had closed the mountain passes. Beaumont saw this as both a problem and an opportunity. Thaddeus's isolation had kept him safe, but it also meant he couldn't escape. This meant that any investigation would have to be done on foot in conditions that regularly killed unprepared men. In November, Beaumont worked hard to build his case. He rode to Harrison, the county seat, without stopping to talk to Sheriff Wade, and gave his evidence to Circuit Judge Nathaniel Frost. Frost, who used to be a prosecutor in Missouri, looked over Beaumont's paperwork with the same care that someone who had seen frontier justice fail too many times because of poor planning would. Frost told him, "This is credible evidence of sexual assault and possible infanticide, but juries in the frontier are strange when it comes to family matters. They need bodies and testimony from the victims themselves. Can those women testify? Are they still able to be good witnesses after all these years?" Beaumont didn't know. He had only heard the sisters talk a little bit. Their mental state was uncharted territory, and the trauma was on a level that his medical training hadn't prepared him for. Judge Frost signed a warrant for Thaddeus Cormier's arrest and ordered a formal investigation. Deputy Marshal Vernon Akins was put in charge of carrying it out. Akins, who had worked as a police officer in Indian Territory for a long time, put together a small group of people. It included himself, Beaumont, a surveyor named Hugh Darrow who was familiar with the mountain geography, and 2 local men who were willing to testify about Thaddeus's strange isolation. They left Jasper on December 4th, and the weather got worse with each mile. Within 6 miles, horses could no longer use the trail to Cormier Hollow. They walked on, carrying only a few supplies, following ridgelines through snow that reached their knees in the valleys. At night, the temperature dropped well below freezing. The men took turns keeping watchfires going, which kept them alive but also let anyone watching from a higher place know they were there. They got to the hollow on December 6th, just before dark. The Cormier cabin had lights on, but no smoke coming from the chimney. This meant that they didn't have enough fuel, which suggested that they were having a hard time. Akins came up in a formal way, announcing his authority and the arrest warrant. A shot from a rifle hit a tree 2 feet from Akins's head. There was a standoff for 3 hours. Thaddeus, who couldn't be seen in the dark cabin, quoted the Bible and said that his property was holy ground that the law couldn't touch. Akins, who was good at siege tactics, just waited, knowing that the cold and dark would help the men outside who had warm clothes and food. Around midnight, Cordelia showed up in the doorway. She was thin and skeletal in a thin dress. She didn't say anything, even though it was freezing outside. She just moved out of the way. Letitia came up behind her, holding a baby. Both sisters walked by Thaddeus, who did nothing to stop them, as if their leaving didn't make sense to his religion. The sisters fell down just a few feet away. Beaumont took care of them for hypothermia and malnutrition, and Akins went into the cabin to arrest Thaddeus. What they found inside was very important evidence. Thaddeus's journal, which had 17 months of detailed entries about sexual assaults framed as religious duty, tracking pregnancies, and decisions about which babies to send back to heaven, was in the main room of the cabin. 7 young girls, ages 2 to 8, were in the back room and showed signs of severe neglect. There were muslin bundles wrapped in wax paper inside a locked chest. The swaddling clothes were stained with blood and kept like holy relics. Thaddeus didn't fight back. Instead, he seemed eager to talk about his beliefs and saw his arrest as a chance to spread the word. He said, "I am like Noah, tasked with preserving righteousness in a corrupted world. These women were given to me, as Eve was given to Adam. The children are covenant, not crime. The most damning evidence lay outside. Surveyor Darrow started digging around the property after reading about strange baby deaths in Opal Gantry's journals. He found disturbed earth in a clearing behind the cabin, which Thaddeus had called the garden where early blessings are planted in his journal. They couldn't dig in the winter. Darrow carefully marked the spots, measuring and making detailed maps, even though the ground was frozen 4 feet deep. The full range of the physical evidence would have to wait until spring thaw. They took Thaddeus to the Newton County Jail in Jasper. Dr. Beaumont sent the sisters and 7 girls to Harrison, where they were placed with a Methodist missionary society that ran a women's shelter. A group of doctors looked at both Leticia and Cordelia and found a lot of reproductive trauma, scars that were consistent with giving birth multiple times without medical help, burns and binding marks, and severe malnutrition. For weeks, neither sister could speak clearly. Leticia rocked back and forth, singing a hymn. Cordelia was scared of male voices and wouldn't let anyone look at her without female nurses present. The kids were behind in their development, spoke a private language that mixed English and biblical phrases, and had trouble understanding that the world outside the hollow was real and safe. When the ground thawed on the 15th of March 1896, Deputy Marshal Akins went back to Cormier Hollow with a full party, which included County Coroner Dr. Milton Starnes. They dug up the marked areas in an orderly way. They discovered 11 infant interments in shallow graves, enveloped in muslin, with remains exhibiting diverse stages of decomposition. Dr. Starnes's exam showed that several of them had skull fractures that were consistent with blunt force trauma. Others didn't have a clear cause of death, which could mean they were smothered or left outside. All of them were babies who were full term or close to full term. Even though Thaddeus said he was religious, none of them had been buried with religious ceremony. The evidence was photographed, written down, and sent to Harrison for the grand jury. The muslin wrappings were the same as the fabric Thaddeus had bought from merchants in Parthenon. The measurements of the remains matched the ages and dates in Opal Gantry's journals and Thaddeus's own records. By the end of March 1896, prosecutors had a strong case against Thaddeus. They had written evidence from him, physical evidence of 11 infant deaths, medical testimony about the sisters' trauma, sworn statements from Opal Gantry, and material evidence linking Thaddeus to the burial site. The Newton County grand jury charged 11 people with murder, 2 people with incestuous assault, and 4 people with false imprisonment on the 2nd of April 1896. Judge Frost was in charge of the trial, which was set to take place in Harrison in May. The investigation that took place in the winter had been a success. Now it was time to pay the price. The state of Arkansas versus Thaddeus Orrin Cormier started on the 11th of May, 1896, in the Boone County Courthouse in Harrison. Judge Frost moved the trial out of Newton County because he was worried about local bias, not against Thaddeus, but against the prosecution itself. People in frontier towns often thought that getting involved in family matters was too much, no matter what the crimes were. There were too many people in the courtroom. The case had gotten a lot of attention in Arkansas and even in national newspapers. The New York Herald wrote about the Ozark horror, and papers in the area argued about whether Thaddeus was crazy or just taking the idea of frontier isolation to its logical end. Thaddeus came in chains, but he acted like a religious person. He had been in jail for 5 months, getting ready for his defense, not by denying what he did, but by framing it as a sacred duty. He didn't want a lawyer because he wanted to represent himself and use the trial as a platform for his religious beliefs. Edmund Hargrove, the prosecutor, had been through many trials on the frontier and knew how dangerous it was. Juries might be more likely to believe religious reasons, especially in a place where people took the Bible literally and were suspicious of outside authority. Hargrove's plan was to present a lot of evidence without making it sound too dramatic. Let the facts speak. Let the horror build up through everyday documentation. The first week was all about establishing the pattern. Dr. Beaumont gave medical evidence about the physical impossibility of the timeline without continuous assault and talked about impossible pregnancy intervals. Opal Gantry, who looked ashamed, talked about 14 births she had been to, the disappearance of male babies, and Thaddeus's payment in advance, which was strange for a place where midwives were usually paid in goods after the fact. Surveyor Darrow talked about how he found the gravesite. Dr. Starnes, the coroner, talked about 11 baby bodies that had skull fractures and were positioned in a way that suggested they had been buried alive or smothered. Pictures of the excavation site were shown as evidence, and some jurors turned away from them. After that, we read Thaddeus's journal out loud for 2 days. The courtroom was quiet, as the entries described years of systematic assault called conjugal covenant, breeding records that tracked ovulation and conception, and planned decisions about which babies to kill. One entry from August 1891 said, "Cordelia gave birth to a boy at dawn. The vessel was imperfect. The covenant says only daughters can carry the blessed line. By sunset, she had returned the child to God's care. She is sad, but grief is the furnace where purity is forged." The prosecution's case ended with medical testimony about the sisters' health. Dr. Beaumont talked about reproductive trauma, scarring, and malnutrition that were typical of years of sexual slavery. He said that both women showed signs of what alienists were starting to call traumatic neurosis, which is when someone has a complete mental breakdown because of long-term horror. The only thing the defense did was have Thaddeus testify on his own behalf. He didn't feel sorry for what he did or realize that it was against the law. Instead, he preached. For 3 days, he talked about his religious beliefs, which were a mix of Old Testament patriarchy, selective scripture, and frontier isolationism. These beliefs made his actions seem like religious duty instead of criminal behavior. Thaddeus said, "Abraham took his sister Sarah to wife. Lot's daughters kept their father's line alive through holy marriage." The ancient patriarchs knew what modern law has forgotten, that bloodline purity requires sacrifice. I am not a criminal. I am a patriarch fulfilling divine command. Judge Frost let this testimony continue because he knew that letting Thaddeus speak would show how depraved he was better than any prosecution cross-examination. The jury needed to hear from the criminal himself how completely he thought he was right. But the testimony that everyone was waiting for never came. Letitia and Cordelia did not show up in court. Dr. Beaumont took care of both of them at the Methodist Refuge in Harrison. He had looked at them carefully and decided that neither of them could give a clear account of what happened. Letitia didn't say much, only sang parts of hymns. Cordelia could answer simple questions, but when asked about specific events, she went into a trance. The prosecution wanted their testimony to make the victim seem more real to the jurors. But Hargrove made a smart choice. Their absence said more than their presence could. In his closing arguments, he said, "The defense asks you to think about theology. I ask you to think about 2 women who are so broken they can't speak. Think about 7 children who still flinch at adult male voices. Think about 11 babies buried in shallow graves. The defendant calls this covenant. The law calls it murder." Thaddeus's closing statement lasted 4 hours. He read from the books of Leviticus, Genesis, and Deuteronomy. He talked about what he thought bloodline purity should be. He didn't realize that what he said was sealing his conviction instead of getting him off. The jury spent 90 minutes talking about it. They found them guilty on all counts: 11 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of incestuous assault, and 4 counts of false imprisonment. Judge Frost sentenced Thaddeus to death by hanging, which was set for July 1896. But the execution never happened. Thaddeus died in his cell on the 23rd of May, 1896, 12 days after being found guilty. Pneumonia was the official cause. The jail doctor saw signs that were consistent with poisoning, sudden onset, vomiting, and convulsions, but there was no formal investigation. A confession letter came out years later. In 1934, Eugene Tolmage, a jail trustee in 1896, confessed on his deathbed that he had poisoned Thaddeus by putting rat poison in his food. Talmage's younger sister went missing in the Ozarks in 1889, and the case is still open. Talmage wrote, "I heard what he did to his sisters. I heard him talk like it was right. I thought about Sarah and what might have happened to her. I put it in his cornbread. I'm not sorry. No charges were ever filed. With Thaddeus's death, the case was officially over." But for the people who were still alive, the silence had just begun. In many ways, the lives that went on after Thaddeus Cormier's death were more tragic than the terrible things that happened before. The case was over, but those who had lived through it still couldn't find justice. Letitia May Cormier never got her speech back together. She stayed at the Methodist Refuge under medical care until February 1899, when she got pregnant, probably because an unknown person attacked her at the facility. She died from an infection during childbirth because her body had been damaged too much by years of forced pregnancy to survive another delivery. She was 27 years old. A simple marker at Harrison Cemetery said she was L.C., sister, victim of evil. Cordelia Rose Cormier lived for a long time after that, but she never really got away from the Hollow. In 1900, she was moved to the State Hospital for the Insane in Little Rock, where she stayed for 24 years. Medical records show that she had what doctors called melancholia with religious delusions, which means she thought she was being punished for sins she didn't know about. She wouldn't let men touch her, needed to be sedated all the time during medical exams, and spent most of her days sitting at a window and looking at the mountains. She passed away from the flu in 1924 at the age of 52. "Is he gone? Tell me true. Is the covenant broken?" were her last words, spoken to a nurse. The 7 daughters who lived were sent to live with different relatives and church families in Arkansas and Missouri. To hide their connection to the case, everyone got new last names. Their results were different. 3 people died before they turned 20. 1 died from complications of childbirth, which suggests generational trauma. Another died from tuberculosis, and the 3rd died under unclear circumstances. 2 of them lived into middle age, but they never married or had kids. They worked as housekeepers in faraway cities. 1 woman got married, but the police took her kids away when her husband told them she was copying Thaddeus's behavior of being alone. Only 1 seemed to be able to live a normal life. She married a railroad worker in Kansas City, had 3 kids, and lived until 1962. However, her grandchildren later said that she never talked about her childhood and burned all the family photos before she died. Dr. Wendell Beaumont kept practicing on the circuit until 1903, when arthritis made him stop. He moved to Little Rock and taught at the medical school. He used the Cormier case in his lectures to show how important it is to report things and be vigilant in medicine. He pushed for laws that would require all births and deaths to be recorded, especially in rural areas. His testimony led the Arkansas legislature to pass the Vital Statistics Act of 1897. This law required county clerks to keep track of all births, deaths, and marriages. The law was passed because the case showed that many births and infant deaths had gone completely unrecorded. Beaumont died in 1918 during the flu epidemic, but he still wrote letters to frontier doctors about how to spot patterns of family violence. People on purpose erased the Cormier property itself. In June 1896, people who are still unknown set fire to the cabin, leaving only its stone foundation. People in the area thought it was vigilantes, but no one looked into it. Within 10 years, the cleared fields had turned back into forest. During the trial, they dug up the whole burial site. The remains were moved to Harrison Cemetery and buried in a mass grave with only the date 1887, 1896 on the headstone. Cormier Hollow had a supernatural reputation by 1910. Parents in the area told their kids scary stories about ghosts and curses to keep them away. Trappers stayed away from it because they said dogs wouldn't be able to follow their scent through the area. The few people who went there said it was a very oppressive place, which was probably just psychological projection but worked to keep the area isolated. The Hollow was mostly off-limits until 1983, when hikers from Little Rock found the remains of the foundation and 3 more shallow grave sites nearby that had been missed during the first excavation. Authorities in Newton County did a second investigation and found the remains of 3 more babies. They were buried again at Harrison Cemetery, and a new memorial was built that said, "Innocence lost, that evil may be remembered, and never repeated." In memory of the children of Cormier Hollow, 1887 to 1896, may their suffering teach us to speak when silence enables evil. The case's legacy went beyond memorials. It became a touchstone for early 20th century talks about family violence and living alone in the country. Medical journals referenced it in investigations of incest, trauma, and reproductive coercion. When legal scholars were arguing for more power over family matters, they used it as an example. People who wanted to change society used it to explain why they should get involved in small communities. But the case also showed some uncomfortable truths about being complicit. The midwife, Opal Gantry, lived until 1932, carrying the weight of her silence. Before she died, she told a newspaper, "I told myself I had no proof, no authority, no right to interfere. The truth is, I was afraid of Thaddeus, of losing income, of being wrong. I saw evil and chose my own comfort over those girls' lives. That's the sin I'll answer for." It was rare for her to be so honest. Most people who knew something was wrong in Cormier Hollow never said anything, even after they died. This includes the merchants who sold Thaddeus supplies for 18 years, the circuit preachers who noticed the family never went to church, the neighbors 6 miles away who heard screams and thought it was wildlife, and the trappers who felt uneasy in the hollow but never told anyone. The case brings up questions that are hard to answer. How does geography make it possible for evil? Cormier Hollow was only 23 miles from the county seat, but it was effectively lawless because it was so far away. Modern GPS and communication would make it impossible for people to be alone, but surveillance technology makes it easier for people to control and abuse others. The question is still how to balance the need to keep an eye out for victims with the right to privacy. What are the boundaries of family autonomy? Thaddeus really thought that his sisters had to listen to him because of religion and tradition. Most people in frontier culture thought that family matters were private unless they caused trouble in public. Where does respecting a family's privacy end and letting victims suffer at home begin? What makes silence a part of the problem? Opal Gantry saw evidence of systematic abuse for 9 years, but she only spoke up after a doctor pushed her to do so. Her reasons, fear, need for money, social pressure, and lack of clear authority are understandable and damning. How can we make it easier for witnesses to speak up sooner, before the number of deaths rises? Can victims testify when trauma makes it hard to speak? At trial, Letitia and Cordelia could not speak for themselves. Because their abuser made them silent, their voices never made it into the legal record. Modern trauma-informed practice acknowledges this pattern. However, how can we empower those silenced by violence? What is the right balance between mercy and punishment? Thaddeus died before he could be executed, most likely because he was murdered. Some people thought this was fair, while others thought it was a denial of the right legal conclusion. His death meant that there would be no appeals, no more investigation into how his beliefs changed, and no chance for him to change or learn more about them. Was it right to poison him, or was it a crime? The Cormier case doesn't give us any answers. It only warns us. It shows that evil grows when people are alone, whether it's because of geography, culture, or morals. It shows that silence is never neutral. People who see abuse and don't say anything are helping it happen. It shows that victims can be hurt so badly that they can't speak up for themselves, which makes outside help not just helpful, but morally necessary. The hollow is empty today. Moss and Virginia creeper cover the foundation stones. The trail is almost invisible and only historians and people who are morbidly curious use it. The Newton County Historical Society keeps records that are sealed so that researchers can see them but not sensationalize them. Most of the descendants of the surviving daughters live normal lives all over the United States and don't know much about their family history. But the hollow remembers. Locals say that on calm days, the trees look like they're watching. There are no wildflowers in the clearing where babies were buried, just bare earth and stone. The spring that gave the Cormier water is still cold and clear, and no animals have touched it. It doesn't matter if these are supernatural events or psychological projections. What matters is what they mean. A community's shared memory of evil, made possible by being alone and kept alive by not talking about it. A scar on the land that time has not healed. The last lesson is that the horror of Cormier Hollow was not unusual. It was just the isolated extreme of patterns that existed and still exist where power is absolute, where victims are invisible, where witnesses choose silence, and where we all agree that some suffering is too inconvenient to acknowledge. The case asks us, what are we choosing not to see today? What screams are we trying to explain away? What remote areas have we agreed are not our responsibility? The void, beyond the world, still exists.